Greetings, everyone, and well met. Welcome to this talk on Guelph Postcards, Images of the Royal City in the Edwardian Era. I'm Cameron Shelley, and I'm giving this talk in the middle of a pandemic in April 2020. So in the following slides, I'll talk a little bit about the history of Guelph Postcards, and since this is a virtual talk, you are welcome to pause it at any time and have a look at the postcards, a more closer look at the postcards for yourselves. And before I begin, first of all, let me thank the Royal City Men's Club for sponsoring the talk. It was originally our intention that I should come and speak to the Men's Club live and in person, but all things considered, that wasn't going to work out. So our substitute was this virtual talk, which I hope you enjoy. So thank you very much to the Royal City Men's Club for making this possible. In this talk, I'll discuss the postcard phenomenon a little bit in general, but focusing on Guelph in particular. The postcard phenomenon was one that happened worldwide, and certainly not just in Guelph, but Guelph got swept up in it along with really every other city in the what you might call the European world. So I'll start off with a little bit of postcard prehistory, because the earliest postcards had no pictures on them, which you might not expect. Picture postcards appeared in the early Edwardian era, and I'll talk a little bit about the people who promoted them, namely Warren Turnbull and Charles L. Nellis. And those early postcards, of course, tended to be black and white or very simple in appearance in some ways, but later on they became colored by a technique known as lithography. So we'll look at some color lithographs of Guelph. And then we'll move on to real photo postcards. So real photo postcards are cards that were printed from photographs that your average Joe or Jane very often took. So we get to see the more impromptu side of Guelph from postcards like that. And then I'll finish up with a little discussion of the end of the postcard craze that corresponded roughly with the end of the Edwardian era. So the slideshow, of course, will present a lot of images of postcards, and that will give us some insight into the Guelph of the Edwardian era as Guelphites and their postcard promoters saw it. And so as a little taste, you can see the postcard on the slide here. That's a view you may recognize, McDonald Street, looking west towards the Church of Our Lady. And one thing that's fun to do with old images like that is have a look at them and see what's familiar and what isn't. So you may notice that the church is missing its towers. Those weren't installed until, I think, 1926. And in the foreground, you can see streetcar tracks going down along Wyndham Street. And of course, those were torn up many years ago. So that's something fun to do as we go along with the talk, is to pause the slides and have a look at the images and see what you can see. There's usually something interesting to be found in an old photograph of Guelph. What we know as postcards today originated, accounts vary, but let's say originated in Europe in the middle 1800s. And in those days, they were really creatures of the postal services of those countries. In other words, post offices strictly regulated what a postcard was and undertook or contracted out the printing for themselves. So those postcards were approved for use in the postal system. And they were very simple. On the one side, they would have an address, that was the front, and on the back they would have a message, and that's it. So there was usually no other image than the image of a stamp printed onto the front. And so on the slide here you can see an example of a Canada postcard. And there's the stamp printed on the front, Queen Victoria, 1 cent I think, and then on the back, in the image to the right, is the message. And these postcards were used mainly for very formal but brief correspondence. So this is an interesting card because it was written by Mr. Peter Gow and sent in 1881. Now, Peter Gow was at the time the sheriff of Guelph, or really South Wellington. And here he's writing a message to one Alexander Micklejohn in Hamilton, and the message says, Sheriff's Office, Guelph, March 5th, 1881. Dear Sir, the favor of the third instant duly received, including $1.08 amount of account rendered. Yours truly, Peter Gow. So Peter Gow was an interesting fellow, an important fellow in Guelph. He was, I think, the first mayor of he was a mayor of Guelph and Guelph's first MPP after Confederation in 1867. He retired in 1876 and became the sheriff, and that was his office when he sent this postcard to Hamilton. So this is quite typical of postcards of the late Victorian era. And it's interesting to note how different they are than letters. So as you may know, letter writing was a big thing in the Victorian era, and people with the means often wrote long and involved letters to one another. And so postcards allowed for a very different kind of correspondence. They were brief and to the point. And at the time, some people worried that the appearance of postcards was going to ruin the epistolary arts. That is, people would forget how to write letters or how to write at length in an elegant manner. I don't know if that's true, but it's interesting to note that postcards introduced a new kind of correspondence. Now, intermittently, in the late Victorian era, postcards with pictures printed on them appeared, and these were often in connection with special events. And one of particular importance was the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And on the slide you can see an example of a souvenir postcard that was printed up especially for that occasion. And it has an image, in this case I think an image of the electrical building at the World's Fair, which was designed to emphasize the daring new world of electricity. And so people who went to the World's Fair collected these items, and they became extremely popular and were really great sellers. And people who promoted postcards and printing in general took this ball and rolled with it and advocated to governments that it should be possible for private companies to print postcards with interesting pictures on them and sell them to the public, but still be allowed to send them through the mail, like the regulation postcards that governments had approved. And by 1900, governments in Europe and North America had all acquiesced. And so the privately printed picture postcard craze got going. People began to collect postcards because of the images on them, as well as to send each other brief little messages. So it did not take very long for the picture postcard phenomenon to arrive in Guelph. And the man who introduced it earliest that I know of was someone called Oren Turnbull. He was Guelph's earliest known postcard producer. He was employed earlier in the late 1890s in the job room at the Guelph Mercury. So the Mercury used to have a facility where you could go and get leaflets or books or things like that printed up, and maybe 100 copies or something like that made. That was the job room, and Oren Turnbull worked there. But being ambitious, he started his own printing business in the late 1890s, and in the early 1900s, one of the things he began to do was to print postcards. And these were what's called the undivided back format, which I'll explain in a later slide in just a moment. So it's the typical form of an early postcard. And he printed a number of these, and they proved to be very popular. Unfortunately, he left Guelph early on, maybe just a year or two into his printing career. His marriage broke up, and he decided to seek his fortune elsewhere. So he eventually went off to Toronto and then finally to Detroit. But nevertheless, he has the distinction being the first one to print private picture postcards. And these were called Turnbull's Private Postals. So we'll see a few on the next slides. So here's our first example of Turnbull's Private Postals. So have a look at that and see if you recognize the scene in the picture in the upper left. course, the caption on the postcard on the right-hand side tells you the answer. It's St. George's Square, the heart, the city of Guelph, which indeed it was, the heart of the commercial district at the time. Of course, the square looks a little different than it does today. So at the back of the square there, you can see the old post office, which is in fact the old post office, the one that was first built in that location. And it was a two-story structure with a little attic. And in 1903, it had a third story put on, along with the clock tower, which is maybe the more familiar old post office that you see in pictures of St. George's Square. So that already tells us that this is quite an old photograph. And in the foreground, you can see the streetcars that were installed in Guelph in 1895, I believe, and there they are, making their way up and down Wyndham Street. And they're making their way around the Blacksmith Fountain. It was a fountain that sat in a little garden in the middle of the square, and was actually a small park. It was run by the Parks Bureau of the government, if you like, and was considered a beauty spot in the middle of Guelph. Now you can see that the postcard has a message written on the front. And this is the standard format of early postcards. So you can see there's a message, and in this case a return address written on the front. And if you look on the lower right-hand corner of the slide, you'll see the back of the card, which has only the address, the addressee's address on it. So that's why this kind of card is called the undivided back. The back was, by regulation, devoted entirely to the address. So space had to be left on the front for the message. And this card happens to have an interesting message. It says, "We were all over the experimental farm here, and I was through Dale's big nursery at Brampton on Friday. It is a very go-ahead place. This is a nice wee town, and is more like home than a lot of them I have been in. We go on to Chicago today. R.H.W." And so R.H.W. is perhaps a relative of the addressee, Mr. James Weddell. So perhaps the two Weddells are corresponding. And Mr. R.H.W. has found himself in Guelph for a day, picked up a postcard at a local shop, and sent his relation a little update on his travels. And thanks to the John Kelleher collection for this example. And here's another example of a Turnbull's private postal. And this building you may well not recognize, but it's the Guelph Collegiate Institute, as the little label says over in the right. And it's another good example of Turnbull's work. There's a nice picture set up on the upper part of the card, with the lower part left blank for a message, which hasn't been written in this case, and a little floral decoration around to make the card a bit more special and attractive. So the Guelph Collegiate at that time sat on the grounds where the Collegiate Institute is now, except this is tucked into the corner near Arnold Street, facing out onto Paisley. And if I'm not mistaken, that was it became an annex to the new school, which is still there, in the 1920s when that was built. And then it was finally demolished in 1962, and the gymnasium of the current building sits about where the gymnasium you can see on the left in that image is located. So that's a little blast from Guelph's past. Now here is another one of Warren Turnbull's postcards, and this one both familiar and unfamiliar looking. So the familiar part is, of course, St. George's Church and the River Speed, which you can see across the footbridge. The footbridge itself is somewhat familiar. That's the Heffernan Street footbridge, but it's the old Heffernan Street footbridge. It was built in 1881, and the location of the footbridge is about the place where the Reverend Palmer, who was the deacon of St. George's Church, used to row across the river to work. So a kind of commuting you might do in Guelph before the age of the automobile. The problem with this bridge was that it was fairly low, as you can see, and when you crossed it, you would be deposited right on the railway tracks that the CPR route took up the river, and that was kind of dangerous. So in 1914, the bridge we're all familiar with was erected instead. That takes people on it over the railway tracks and right across to Woolwich Street. Now, this is a very popular image. So this image continued to be reproduced on Guelph postcards for many years later, and seemed to have been a big seller. So it's a clear indication that people were very interested in postcards of bridges and churches, and the two together. So this was an image that attracted a lot of customers. All right, Warren Turnbull was an early postcard producer and produced a number of very interesting postcards of Guelph in its early days, at least the early Victorian era. But as I said, he also left town fairly early on and doesn't figure in the rest of the history of postcards of Guelph. But the man who is maybe the most significant postcard seller in Guelph in that era was Charles L. Nellis. And he was essentially a lifelong Guelphite. He took over his father's store called the City Bookstore in 1891 and ran it really for the rest of his career into the late 1920s. He was highly successful at that and rose up in the ranks of the trade, became the president of the Booksellers and Stationers Association, and was a very eminent Guelphite, and also one of the founders of St. James's Church, which you undoubtedly know of. And he has a particular important place in the history of Guelph postcards, in part because in 1904 he commissioned a set of photographs to be printed by the Albertype Company, it's a printing company of Brooklyn, New York. And so a photographer from that company, Mr. Runyons, as it happens, showed up in Guelph in 1904 and took a number of pictures of Guelph of that era, many of which were turned into postcards. So that provides a very interesting view of the city in that sort of early Edwardian period. The other thing that distinguishes Charles Nellis is that he continued to sell postcards of Guelph into the 1920s, really up to the time that he retired. So what we'll do now is look at some of the postcards that Nellis produced and sold of the Royal City. Now, just for a moment before we do that, I thought it would be interesting to see an image of his bookstore, the City Bookstore, which was at this time in St. George's Square in the middle of town. So there you see it on the left-hand side. That's an image from the Guelph Public Library. And it's a 3-story structure and store, and I believe you can see Charles Nellis himself standing in the doorway in the lower right. It was a bookstore, so of course it sold books, it sold stationery, it sold art supplies. As you can see from the sign at the top, it sold wallpaper, fine leather goods, and all kinds of other things that were quite common in bookstores at the period. Happily, that building is still with us today. And on the right-hand side, you can see an image of that building taken from Google Street View just a couple of years ago. Anyway, let's go on and have a look at some of the postcards that Nellis produced. So, without looking at the caption, can you tell where this postcard is where this postcard is set? Well, perhaps you have. It's, as the caption says, the Free Library in Norfolk Street. So this is a view up Norfolk Street where Paisley, Quebec, and Norfolk Street all meet, as well as Yarmouth Street there on the right-hand side. So that structure on the left is the old Carnegie Public Library, or the Free Library as it was known at the time. Now, that's a very interesting structure in its own right. It was built in 1905 and was designed by a local architect, W. Fry Colwell. And it was a Carnegie Library because the Guelph City Hall and some eminent citizens managed to get the money to build it from the Carnegie Foundation in the United States. And it's one of many Carnegie libraries that were built in southern Ontario and of course elsewhere in that period. Of course, that library was pulled down and the new library set up in 1964, the current library. So it does look a little different. If you look along the street a little further up, you can see there's a St. Andrew's steeple on the right, which is still there, but on the left-hand side there's another steeple, and that was the steeple of the Congregational Church, which was pulled down, I think, in 1950. That's the site currently of the Norfolk Manor. So there's some familiar things about that image and some unfamiliar things. Now, looking at the front of the card, you can see it's still very much in the format of Orrin Turnbull's private postals. There's an image in the upper half of the front, and there's space underneath for the text to be written, and then on the back would be the address. And this one is actually sent through the mail. If you look on the lower left-hand side, there's a little round cancellation mark that says AU3, and then underneath that 06, which tells us that it was cancelled by the post office on August 3rd, 1906. So that is when this card went through the mail. Now here's another interesting postcard that Charles Nellis produced, and it's a healthcare related postcard. So you can see there are 3 images of healthcare related sites in the Royal City. The one in the upper right hand might not be familiar. It is, I don't know, underneath you can see on a little ribbon it says Homewood Sanitarium. The building that you see in the picture in the upper right is the old manor building, which unfortunately burned down in 1911. So that is why it isn't familiar. But that is the Homewood picture of the Homewood Sanitarium. And then on the left-hand side is the General Hospital, as it existed at that time. Obviously very different from the General Hospital that we're familiar with today. And then on the bottom is St. Joseph's Hospital, which of course was pulled down a few years ago. So this postcard takes several images of Guelph and combines them into one. And there are a couple of things to notice about it. First of all, the images all combined take up really the entire front of the postcard. And that was a new development in postcard formatting or postcard technology or actually regulation of the time. And the idea was that both the message and the address could be written on the back. So if you look in the lower right corner of the slide, you can see a little bit that the text was written in the left-hand margin, and then the addressee's location was written on the right side. So this is called a divided back postcard for that reason. And the divided back format is, of course, the format that we're familiar with today. The other thing to note about this postcard is if you look carefully in the very lower left corner, you can see a little sort of handwritten scrawl that says hand-colored. And of course this postcard has a little bit of coloring on it, which is an attempt to make it more interesting than a strictly black and white or grayscale postcard would be. So that's a postcard that shows us Nellis trying to take advantage of the divided back format by filling the front of the postcard with images. In this case, a collection of images of the Royal City. Alright, here's an interesting postcard. This is a postcard of, can you recognize it? It says the City Hall. Does it look like the City Hall? If you look at it for a little while, you might recognize it, but it is quite different. This was an era when the City Hall had a very large clock tower sitting perched on the top of the building. And another thing that's quite different is that the big via station that's next to the City Hall right now wasn't there. And in fact, this is a photograph of what was called Jubilee Park. So the site of the train station in that era was the site of a public park. And it was called Jubilee Park because it was created in 1887 on the occasion of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. So before that, there used to be a vegetable market with a big stall, and people could go there and buy and sell vegetables on market days. But in honor of the Queen's Golden Jubilee, it was turned into a public space. And you can see here, and this is something I really enjoy about the photograph, you can see how people are just out having a good time in Jubilee Park on what I take to be a warm summer's day. So I invite you to have a look around the photograph and see what other things are similar or different from what a similar view would look like today. I guess another thing to point out about this picture is if you look in the very left-hand corner, the lower left-hand corner, you can see Chas L. Nellis. And so this is one of the ways in which you can identify Charles Nellis's cards, because he liked to have his name written somewhere in the margins of the image. So he was not only promoting Guelph, but also himself when he was selling these postcards. Here's another one of my favorite images of the royal city in the Edwardian era. This, of course, is the entrance to Riverside Park. And I believe it's the entrance, the location of the entrance is the same as the entrance to Riverside Park today, off of Woolwich Street, although of course it looks quite different. It says, of course, the sign says Riverside Park. There's a couple of little signs on the side which say no driving allowed. And that's interesting because it means that the owners of the park were in fact the streetcar company of Guelph, didn't want people to drive there. So the idea was that people should take the streetcar from Guelph out into the township, which is where this was located, and take the streetcar to the park and have a good time and then take the streetcar back. So Riverside Park was opened in 1905 as an attraction to get people to take the streetcar there and back along a route that was otherwise pretty empty. So the entrance itself is kind of nice. You can see people going in there and having a good time. And if you look into the back, in between the signpost there, you can see a fence. And that, I believe, is where the deer run was located. So there used to be a menagerie in Riverside Park, including a pen containing deer that people could go and gawk at. That was one of the many things you could do at Riverside Park at the time. Now we've seen some interesting examples of postcards of the Guelph area that people would send to each other for various reasons. But one of the main reasons that people sent postcards in this era was that they were collectible. In fact, the collecting of postcards during the Edwardian era was known as a mania or a craze, because I don't know how many tens or more millions of postcards were sent for the purpose of being collected. People would keep these collections in boxes, or in special albums that were printed for the purpose. You can see an example of one of those on the right-hand side of the slide. Postal souvenirs. People might send collectible cards to their relations, young nephews and nieces, or sons and daughters, for example, who were keen on collecting them. People also formed clubs where they could correspond with others overseas. And so people from one continent would send postcards to others far away and receive postcards from them in return. People had all kinds of different preferences about collecting. They might collect specific things like government buildings, pictures of railway stations, schools, churches, bridges, places of natural beauty like lakes and rivers. All of these are very common, and more. Now the postcards we've been looking at so far, and many of the early ones are like that, are black and white. But the postcard producers quickly realized that adding color to postcards would add to their value, so they could be sold for more, and add to their collectability. So color was often added by color lithography in order to make the cards more valuable. So what we're going to do now is look at some color lithographed postcards of the royal city that were sold during the Edwardian era. Now this is a postcard that might be more difficult to recognize, even if you look at the caption. This is because it's the central school, but the one that existed before the current one. So this is obviously quite a bit different in style. It was built in 1876 and from local limestone. And in fact, some old students pointed out that if you went up to the structure and looked at the stones very closely, you might find old fossils in them from the making of the limestone itself. See, it's quite a tall structure. The belfry on top was apparently 45 feet high, and the verticality of the design was very deliberate. I think the central school's design was meant to capture some of the skyline of Guelph in that era. Of course, in 1968, it was demolished, and the current central school, which is a much lower structure, was put up there instead. So this is the appearance of the central school that you would see from Dublin Street. Here's an interesting card, and certainly one that would be difficult to place without the caption that goes with it. And that is the Old Grand Trunk Station. And indeed it is or was the old Grand Trunk Station. It was built, I think, in 1856 when the railway first came to town. And people complained about it for many decades before it was replaced by a new one. Complained about it being too small and inadequate and so forth. So the station was around for quite a while when this postcard was produced around 1910. In fact, the picture itself may date from about 1895, so this is an example of a postcard that was printed from what was already an old photograph when the postcard was made up. The old Grand Trunk Station was torn down in 1911 when the new train station, the one that we're all familiar with, was put up. And there are a number of buildings you can see here that in the background that are certainly different today. So in the background there you can see the old Bell organ factory, which I believe burned down in 1945. And a little further in the background there's the City Hall with its old clock tower on. And the old Grand Trunk Station stands about where the bus station, the transit station, currently stands at the end of Carden Street. And this view would have been taken from about where Knee Street crossed the tracks in those days. So this is an interesting example of how postcard producers picked up old photographs that had been taken many years previously and made postcards out of them. Alright, this is another building that is probably difficult to recognize because it's no longer around, and that is, as you can see, the Opera House. The Opera House was built in 1894 with the intention of bringing a classy venue for entertainment to Guelph. So you could go there and see theatrical performances and later movies in a pleasing and high culture setting. And it sat where the Guelph Community Health Center stands today, on the corner of Wyndham and Woolwich Streets. And it's another interesting postcard. You can look around and see where there are some people in odd places. And if you look at the right, there's a pole with an arc light hanging from it. That was the street lighting system of the day before incandescent lighting came along. The Opera House was torn down in 1953 and replaced by a Simpson Sears store. And here's an interesting one. This is, as you can see from the caption, the first house in Guelph, which was the CPR station when this postcard was produced. The postcard was sent in about 1905, and you can see even though there's space on the back for the sender to write a message, they've also included something in the white space on the front, which is what? Will write soon, many happy returns, thanks for letter. So someone just keeping up correspondence with their addressee. Now, the building itself was indeed the first house in Guelph. It was built in 1827 for the Canada Company, and it served as John Galt's residence while he was here. And then it passed through a number of hands as a private residence until it was turned into the CPR station in 1887 when that railway was built. It's one of the most common postcard images of Guelph. So it was a very popular thing to sell to visitors when they came to Guelph. Apparently visitors to the town found the priory quite interesting, no doubt in part because of its antiquity. It's interesting to note that the locals on the whole didn't find it that interesting, and it was finally torn down after being decommissioned as a train station. It was torn down in 1926, despite some efforts on the part of some prominent citizens like George Sleeman to save it. Its location is roughly in where John Galt Park is today, down beside the River Run Center. The kinds of postcards we've been looking at so far are all mass production cards. So they were typically produced from photographs taken by professional photographers. They were themselves printed professionally by specialized publishers, and they were run in lots of thousands, and were sold by, you know, local merchants, bookstore vendors like Charles Nellis and so forth. So that gives us one angle on the postcard trade at the time, but there was another interesting perspective on it as well, and that is that postcards could also be produced by amateurs. So you could take a photograph of something you were interested in, send the negative off to a printer, and request that they print you off a number of copies on postcard stock that you could then send through the mail. And those would typically be in small lots, maybe 10, 20, 50, 100. You could send them to friends and family for a special event, or maybe a few more if you're planning to sell them for a special occasion. So they're interesting because they're often used by ordinary people, and they present a different they reflect the interests of ordinary people more than the professional producers. And as I said, they're usually printed in small lots, so they're often more difficult to come by currently. And they're much more personal in nature, typically, so they reflect personal moments, things that were important to the people involved, particularly local events, sometimes disasters. So when something like a fire or a train wreck happened, people would rush out and take pictures and make postcards of them to send to their friends. So what we're going to do now is look at a few of these so-called real photo postcards. And here is one of my favorite postcards of Guelph in the Edwardian era, and that is of the what's called the Post Office Square in the caption. It's of course St. George's Square, looking up Wyndham Street towards the old post office that was there. And this is one of my favorites because of the atmosphere that it has. It was clearly taken on a cloudy day. There's some mist in the air, and so things are a little out of focus, and the streets are muddy instead of nice and perfect. And you can see some other indications that it's not a professional card. There are lots of ghosts in the image, so there are people who are moving too fast to be recorded very accurately given the slow shutter speed of the camera. And so these are all features that you find in real photo postcards taken by, somebody who was just interested in the scene in front of them. But I think it's a wonderful view of St. George's Square on a kind of an average day. One of the interesting things to note about it is if you look on the right, you can see there's a building that says the Waters Bros, the Waters Brothers, on the right-hand side of the square. They were kind of an office stationery wallpaper kind of operation, and they sold a lot of postcards. So it's possible that this very postcard could have been sold in their shop. Another way you can tell that it's an amateur postcard is by the caption. So instead of being printed professionally in a nice type, it's been scrawled by hand, perhaps scratched into the negative itself. That's not unusual for these sorts of postcards. Here's another interesting postcard, a real photo postcard. It's of the old dairy building at the Ontario Agricultural College. It's the old building being located approximately where the current building is, up on Gordon Street. And this is interesting because it features a lot of people, and they're looking at the camera. So in the professional postcards we saw earlier, there are usually not many people, and when there are people, they're not particular people. They're just sort of incidental. The focus of the postcards was to capture important sites like buildings and lakes and rivers and whatnot. But real photo postcards are often attempt to capture individual people in some way. So the photographer was probably a student at the OAC when this postcard was sent, which was February 1910, and he wanted to take a picture of his buddies in the dairying class. So there they are in the dairy building learning about the modern dairy industry. And for whatever reason, the photographer wanted to record them doing their thing while they were learning about this at the OAC. So this is something that really distinguishes a lot of real photo postcards from the mass-produced postcards that we looked at before. here's another nice postcard. And again, it's a real photo postcard, and it certainly seems like something that was taken by an amateur rather than a professional, because it features a cow's bum so clearly in the lower left-hand corner, which I suspect a professional photographer would avoid. And this, if you didn't already know where it was, it might be a very difficult scene to place, but it's in fact the bridge over the Speed at Edinburgh Road. Although, of course, this is an earlier bridge than the one we know today. In fact, in those days it was called Wells Bridge, because Mr. Arthur Wells was an important Guelphite, an important citizen who owned a lot of the property on the corner you can see over on the right-hand side across the river. So it was very common to refer to bridges according to the owner of the main owner of the land nearby, and that was the case here. And you can see it was used as pasture, so there are cows and whatnot around there. And it was sent in 1906. And if you look at the top, you can see a little dedication, "Yours truly, Helen Bollard, Guelph, Ontario." This is sent to another girl in Normandy, France. I suspect that Helen and this other girl in Normandy were correspondents in a postcard exchange club. So the girl in Normandy perhaps collected postcards of cows or rivers or bridges or all of the above, and they got in touch through a club, and so Helen sent her this picture, and no doubt got a postcard or two in reply of whatever sort of thing she was collecting. And in fact, this became a very popular picture. It was later produced professionally in color lithograph postcards as well. Now, this postcard is, in my experience, the most common real photo postcard of Guelph. And the reason for that is, I think, because it was a picture of Guelph's Old Home Week in 1908. So the Old Home Week was an occasion when present and former residents of the city got together and just celebrated being from Guelph. And they did it for a whole week. So there'd be all kinds of wingdings, parades, which you can see here, and other events throughout the city over that whole time. And as I said, all the old boys and old girls, people who formerly lived in the town, would come to town and celebrate everything Guelph. So this 1908 was the first Old Home Week, and perhaps the biggest. It was long remembered, and many photographs of it were taken, and this one was run off as a postcard probably in the hundreds, maybe the thousands, and sold to people who were at the event or sent to people later on to commemorate it. And so it was one of the most important or significant real photo postcards taken in Guelph in the Edwardian era. Well, they say what goes up must come down, and the same is true of the golden age of postcards. So by 1910, the craze for postcard collecting was starting to subside. Partly it was no doubt due to the novelty starting to wear off, and partly due to saturation of the marketplace. That is, a lot of people had probably collected all of the post offices, bridges, and churches that they wanted to, and so it became more difficult to sell postcards, and so people began to stock fewer of them. And people who continued to sell them often looked for ways of making them a little cheaper and more affordable, so as to pick up sales. So the collecting of postcards subsided, but they still remain popular as a souvenir of one's travels, and as they're still used today, just a way to connect with people when you're on the road, very briefly. So producers, as I said, turned to cheaper or less colorful formats. Not that the colored postcard was abandoned, just that you find a resurgence, if you like, of other kinds of presentations. And so this is true of postcards of Guelph. And one particular series of note in this period, the sort of the end of the Edwardian era, was made by the International Stationery Company of Picton, Ontario, and they published really a lovely series of sepia-toned Guelph pictures. And so we're going to look at a few of those in the upcoming slides. So here's a lovely example of one of the International Stationery Company's pictures of Guelph. And this is a boating scene, as you can see. And here we have three ladies rowing in a rowboat. The caption on the bottom says, "Seen on the River Speed, Guelph, Canada." But the caption is a little deceptive because the boat is actually more than likely on the Aramosa River. And this reminds us of something that was different about the way the names of the rivers were used in those days. So in the Edwardian era, previously, and for some years afterwards, the Aramosa River was often called the Aramosa branch of the Speed, or sometimes just the Speed. So it can be a little confusing. But the Aramosa River was and remains a much calmer river and easier to boat on, and also did not have any mills sited on it in the vicinity of Guelph, so it was very easy to boat up and down the river, much more so than on what we call the River Speed today. So when you see boating pictures of Guelph, the caption will often say, "Boating on the Speed," but in fact it's probably on what we would call the Aramosa River. And these ladies are very likely paddling out in the Aramosa River near where the reformatory was later located. But it has that lovely sepia tone that I was talking about. And I think the sepia tone is very deliberate. It's a deliberate choice. The postcard hasn't actually faded in colors. It was made to look that way. And I think it was made that way to evoke nostalgia. So people in the time would have been familiar with the way photographs faded into sort of a yellow tone when they got old. And that could evoke a kind of nostalgia for the old days. And so this postcard, the series of postcards, are colored the same way, I suspect for similar reasons. Here's another postcard in the same series, and has the same sepia tone to it, except there are a lot more people in it. And this is, as the caption says, set at the CPR station in Guelph. And this CPR station was the one that was built to replace the Priory in 1911. It's built by the CPR down at the bottom of Trafalgar Square. So this is where the Trafalgar apartments are now, by the Speed River near the Aramosa crossing. And you can see there are a lot of people in this picture. It seems like a train has just arrived and people are getting off and they're heading across the square and up to Wyndham Street. And the reason is, I think, because they are attending the 1913 Old Home Week. So this is Guelph's second Old Home Week, following up the one in 1908. And so hundreds, thousands of people are returning to Guelph along with their friends and families in order to have a good time at another week-long bash. Another postcard in the same series shows what is clearly a big parade. As you can see, the floats being drawn by horses along the streets and bedecked with flowers. There's quite a bit of bunting over the street, so somebody has pulled out all the stops in order to decorate the town. And behind the floats you can see a couple of automobiles coming into view. And one of the events during the Old Home Week, 1913, was a parade of all the automobiles in Guelph. So in 1913, having an automobile was still unusual enough that it warranted being put into a parade. So can you imagine holding a parade like that today, where you had all the automobiles in Guelph driving down a street? I think today we just call that traffic, but back then it was a big deal. You might notice that the caption of the postcard just says "The Armories," which is the building in the background, which seems very peculiar. My guess is that these postcards, even though they were of a specific event, were given generic captions in order to make them more saleable after the event had passed. So these would be sold in stores in Guelph for years afterwards, and people who came in order to pick them up or were looking for postcards didn't care anymore about Old Home Week in 1913, but they might buy a picture of a float or a picture of the Armories. So all of these postcards are given generic captions in spite of the fact that they're recording a very specific event in Guelph history. Carrying on with the theme of Old Home Week in 1913, here's a picture of Eramosa Road. You can see if you look at the caption that it says Eramora Road. That was a typo of the sort that sometimes creeps into postcard captions of that era, or any era, I suppose. It's really a lovely picture of Eramosa Road. If you look down the road, you can see the old Eramosa Road bridge and the hill in behind. And coming up the road, there's railway safety arms that are raised up in the air. There's a car that's turning into a garage, an early automobile, and actually a train sitting on the tracks near the crossing, but apparently not moving. And if you look around the scene a bit more, there's lots of decorations on the building, the factory on the right, and even over Eramosa Road itself. So this is another indication that this is a scene where there's a big town celebration going on. Very likely, I think, the Old Home Week of 1913. And one thing I really enjoy about this, along with the other pictures in this series, is that people feature quite prominently in it, which is an unusual feature for professional postcards, as I remarked earlier. So this is a lady with perhaps a couple of little girls, her daughters, on hand, and they're in their good clothes and they're headed downtown to enjoy some of the festivities of Old Home Week in 1913. Well, I think that's probably enough for now. We've seen some interesting postcards of Guelph in the Edwardian era and learned a little bit about the city as it existed at the time and about the postcard phenomenon that occurred in it and everywhere else across the sort of European world at the time. So we can draw some interesting conclusions about the postcard era, the golden age of postcards as it's sometimes called. One is that people were clearly quite interested in a kind of affordable virtual tourism. They took a lot of pleasure in seeing places they had never been to or probably would never go to as they were depicted on a picture postcard. This wasn't a new thing. People could do that with books and magazines earlier, but postcards cost only a few cents and could come from anywhere and be sent anywhere. So it's a new mode of this sort of tourism. Also, of course, it represents a development of the consumer culture around images. So postcards were run off by the millions and sent, in I don't know how many millions around the world over that time. And so the idea of collecting and consuming images in that way became a phenomenon at that time. And postcards, as I think I mentioned a little while earlier, also popularized short messages as a social medium. So rather than writing long letters to people, and before the era when many people had telephones where they could call each other, people could write postcards. And they combined an interesting image with a short message, and that was a new thing and became very popular at the time. And of course it's interesting for us because that kind of communication has become very important again in the modern era of social media. And so postcards provide us with an interesting window onto the royal city in the Edwardian era before the Great War. The collecting craze itself abated as the Great War approached. The First World War produced a lot of postcards. There was a flood of cards from the front to the people back home, from soldiers connecting with their families and friends and vice versa. But they weren't often collected or regarded in the same way as the postcards of the Edwardian craze. So thanks again to the Royal City Men's Club for making this lecture possible, and thank you in particular to John Snade, who is the organizer of this lecture series. If you would like to find out more about Guelph Postcards of the Edwardian era particularly, you can visit my blog. You can see the URL there, guelphpostcards.blogspot.ca. I'd be very happy for you to have a look at that, leave a comment, and find out more about the postcards of Guelph of an earlier day. Thank you. Oh, and one more thing, as Steve Jobs liked to say, if you enjoyed the video, then please leave a like on the thumbs up button down underneath the screen there. Also, I invite you to share the video with anyone you think who might enjoy it. And if you have any questions or comments, those are most welcome. So just enter your question or comment in the comment section underneath the video window, and I'll be monitoring those for some time, and we'll endeavor to get back to you. All right, thanks again. Take care.